What you are about to hear is a story that will touch your heart. What happens when a man who has everything money can buy discovers that the only thing he really needs cannot be purchased? A story about loss, unexpected connection, and a love that heals in the most surprising ways. Stay tuned until the end to discover how a small gesture can change everything. If you like this type of content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Cuentos Que Enamoran. We post videos every day, and please like the video if you enjoy this story. Leave us a comment telling us where you are from and what time you listen to us. A multimillionaire father, broken by the loss of his wife and desperate for help, fired 7 different nannies in less than a year because none of them could handle the challenges of his young autistic son, until one day the new employee he had hired simply to clean the house knelt down, extended her hands, and gently encouraged the child to walk. And against all odds, the baby took his first real steps straight into her arms. Adrian Montenegro came home later than usual that night, his shoulders heavy from another long day at the company. He expected silence in the house, the same stillness that had followed him since the death of his wife. The mansion always felt empty despite the presence of his staff. But that day, something different caught his attention. In the living room, instead of the usual order and formality, he saw Lucia, the new employee, kneeling on the carpet with her arms outstretched. In front of her was Lucas, her little son, staggering unsteadily on his little legs. Adrian froze for a moment in the doorway, unsure of what he was seeing. Lucia's face was calm but full of determination as she encouraged the child to take another step forward. Her voice was soft, not demanding, but firm, repeating the same word over and over again. "Come on, Lucas." The baby leaned forward with his arms outstretched, his body trembling from the effort of trying something new. Adrian's first instinct was to intervene, to tell him it was useless. Lucas never responded, never tried. However, something in the room stopped him. For the first time, he didn't interrupt. He just stood there watching his son and the new employee face a challenge together. Adrian's thoughts swirled as he watched the scene. He remembered the 7 nannies before Lucia, all of them leaving frustrated or fired by him. None of them had lasted because none of them had shown him what he wanted. A miracle, a replacement for his late wife, someone who could fill the void she left behind. Every woman had tried, and everyone had failed to connect with Lucas in a way that Adrian considered good enough. The guilt over his wife's absence weighed on him every day, and with each new nanny, he became harder, more impatient. But seeing Lucia's persistence, something troubled him. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't rushing or panicking under pressure. She was simply focused on Lucas, treating him not as a problem to be solved, but as a child, learning at his own pace. Adrian found himself holding his breath. Lucas's little face tensed with concentration as he took a shaky step. Then he fell forward into Lucia's arms. She didn't seem disappointed. She smiled, clapped softly, and whispered words of encouragement in his ear. Adrian, still standing in the doorway, felt emotions stir that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. The housekeeper in the corner looked at Adrian as if to warn him not to interrupt what was happening. But Adrian couldn't move anyway. He remembered his wife holding Lucas, newborn, whispering promises of how she would watch him grow, walk, and talk. That dream had been shattered too soon, leaving Adrian desperate to fulfill it alone. However, he had failed time and time again. His power and money could build companies, control markets, and buy anything in the world, but they couldn't make Lucas say a word or take a step. Seeing Lucia now, Adrian realized how deeply he had tied his son's progress to the memory of his wife. Each setback felt like further proof that Lucas was destined to live in silence, and that Adrian himself was incapable of guiding him. Still, the way Lucia applauded after a failed step and spoke gently to the baby challenged his certainty. Perhaps patience mattered more than success in the moment. Perhaps the effort itself was a victory. Adrian's chest tightened at the thought, though he refused to admit it aloud. Lucia adjusted Lucas on her lap and tried again. She gently placed him back on the rug, showing no frustration. Lucas staggered as he stood up, his little hands opening and closing in the air, searching for balance. Adrian expected him to sit down immediately as he usually did, but instead the baby moved forward again. Lucia held out her hands with a smile fixed on her face, repeating in her firm tone, "You can do it, Lucas." The child's steps were not steady, but this time he managed to take a few small steps before collapsing forward once again. Lucia hugged him and celebrated as if he had run across the entire room. Adrian felt something stirring, something that was both relief and fear. Relief that his son might not remain stuck at the same stage forever. Fear because it meant that all his harshness, his quick dismissals, his constant doubts might have been the wrong way to handle things. For the first time, he wondered if the problem had never been Lucas or the nannies. Perhaps the problem had been him, his inability to accept imperfection, his refusal to give time and patience the space they needed. As the night grew quieter, Adrian finally infiltrated the room more fully, though he still didn't say a word. He wanted to ask Lucia how long she had been trying this exercise, how often she worked with Lucas, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he focused on Lucas's little feet pressing into the carpet, his attempts to stand up again, and Lucia's tireless encouragement, Lucia. He noticed details he had ignored before, how Lucas's eyes followed Lucia closely, how he seemed calmer in her presence, how her smile gave him confidence. These were things that money couldn't buy. They were things he had been blind to. Adrian realized that his constant search for the perfect caregiver had made him overlook the simple truth that Lucas didn't need perfection. He needed someone who was present, patient, and willing to try without fear of failure. Lucia, without knowing it, was showing Adrian the difference between control and care. It was something he had been unable to provide since the death of his wife. Adrian's chest rose and fell heavily as he finally sat down in the armchair on the other side of the room. He didn't interfere, but he stayed close enough to observe everything. Lucas tried again, falling and getting up, failing and trying again, always welcomed into Lucia's arms. Each attempt brought a small victory, even if it ended in collapse. Richard felt a weight inside him shift. He had spent months building walls, protecting himself from disappointment, dismissing anyone who reminded him of failure. However, Lucia's quiet persistence broke through those walls in a way he couldn't resist. He didn't know what this meant for the future, but at that moment, the silence that had plagued his home felt less heavy. Seeing Lucas catch up with Lucia again, Adrian understood that something was changing slowly, painfully, but certainly there was progress. And for the first time since his wife's death, Adrian allowed himself to feel hope, even if only a little, as he watched Lucia kneeling on the floor, guiding her son forward, one step at a time. Adrian entered the living room and stopped the moment he saw Lucia on the carpet with Lucas. At first, he remained silent, just watching her hold out her arms and gently call to the baby, but his expression quickly hardened. To him, this scene felt wrong. She wasn't hired to play this kind of role. Her job was simple: keep the house clean, organize things, and follow instructions. But here she was, sitting on the floor, encouraging her son to walk as if she were his mother. Adrian's chest tightened and his face flushed. He took a step forward. However, here she was, sitting on the floor, encouraging her son to walk as if she were his mother. Adrian's chest tightened and his face flushed. He took a step forward. However, here she was, sitting on the floor, encouraging her son to walk as if she were his mother. Adrian's chest tightened and his face flushed. He took a step forward. However, here she was, sitting on the floor, encouraging his son to walk as if she were his mother. Adrian's chest tightened and his face flushed. He took a sharp step forward, his voice cold and louder than he had intended. He demanded to know what she thought she was doing. Lucia froze, her hands still outstretched toward Lucas, who immediately sat down on the floor when he heard his father's tone. Adrian pointed at her and reminded her that her role in the house had nothing to do with raising Lucas. She was there to take care of chores, not to cross boundaries. His words came out quickly and harshly, almost like accusations, making it clear that she had crossed boundaries that were not hers to touch. Lucia lowered her head, her face flushed with embarrassment. She tried to speak, her voice uncertain, almost apologetic. She explained that Lucas had been crying for a long time and that she couldn't just stand by and ignore him. She had only wanted to calm him down and give him a little distraction. Her words did not convey defiance, only discomfort, as if she knew she had entered dangerous territory. She tried to explain further, saying that she noticed Lucas trying to get up, so she thought it would be good to cheer him up. Adrian, however, did not soften. He kept his stance firm, his eyes sharp, reminding her once again that she was not hired to get involved in her son's development. His tone made it clear. To him, her actions were not kindness, but interference. Lucia, now visibly nervous, nodded quickly and lowered her gaze to the floor, almost cowering under the weight of his anger. The room became tense, and Lucas, confused by the sudden change in energy, pressed himself closer to her leg but remained silent. Adrian turned to end the discussion, but he couldn't get the image out of his mind, even as he tried to focus on the work papers on the nearby table. His thoughts replayed what he had witnessed moments before. Lucas had moved toward Lucia with a determination that Adrian had never seen before. The little boy's arms had reached out in his direction, his face showing a confidence and focus he had never shown anyone else, not even Adrian himself. That sight had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. His anger was easier to show than his confusion. If he admitted what he saw, it would mean accepting that Lucia had succeeded where he had failed. That idea was intolerable to him. Instead, he forced himself to remain distant, convinced that maintaining control was the only way to keep order in his home. Still, his thoughts betrayed him, returning again and again to the image of Lucas's trembling steps. Lucia, meanwhile, kept her hands busy with meaningless tasks to avoid the silence that pressed down on the room. She picked up toys scattered on the carpet, folded a small blanket, and avoided eye contact with Adrian. She felt ashamed, but at the same time she could not ignore the memory of Lucas's effort. For her, the child's attempt to walk had been more than just a little exercise. It was a moment of progress, something that showed potential for growth if handled with patience. She wanted to tell Adrian this, to explain that it wasn't about crossing boundaries, but about responding to the child's needs. However, she bit her tongue, realizing that nothing she said now would make him see her intentions differently. Instead, she accepted his cold reaction in silence, even though she felt guilty for possibly having made his position in the house unstable. She feared that, like others before her, she would soon be fired. Adrian finally sat down in his chair, trying to immerse himself in the papers. He was probably trying to distract himself from the conversation he had just had with her. He was probably trying to distract himself from the conversation he had just had with her. He was probably trying to distract himself from the conversation he had just had with her. He was probably trying, possibly having made her position in the house unstable. She feared that, like others before her, she might soon be fired. Adrian finally sat down in his chair, trying to immerse himself in the papers, but he could still hear Lucas's soft whimpers. The baby was no longer crying, but had crawled back to Lucia's side, pressing himself against her as if seeking protection. Adrian's chest tightened again when he saw this. He didn't understand why Lucas responded to her in ways he never responded to him. He told himself it was temporary, that it didn't mean anything. But his mind recalled the moment when Lucia had clapped softly for Lucas's effort. He remembered the way Lucas's eyes lit up, even if only for a second. No matter how hard Adrian tried to convince himself that Lucia was wrong to intervene, deep down he couldn't ignore what he had seen. He closed his eyes, pressing his hand against his forehead, pretending to be tired. But in reality, he was struggling with emotions he didn't want to face. The room remained heavy with silence, broken only by the soft sounds Lucas made as he played near Lucia. Adrian avoided looking at them. However, every time his eyes wandered, he caught the same sight. His son showing a kind of confidence that had been absent for so long. It was a confidence that Adrian had never been able to inspire. He tried to harden himself, to cling to the belief that Lucia had gone too far and needed to be corrected. But the image of Lucas's small steps toward her kept coming back. For Adrian, this wasn't just about an employee stepping out of line. It was something deeper, something that shook the certainty he had built around himself since his wife's death. And although he forced himself to remain distant and cold, deep down he knew the truth. Lucia had reached Lucas in a way that no one else had. He could deny it to her face, but he couldn't erase it from his mind. Lucia had already made a decision. After the incident with Adrian, she decided she would not stay in the house any longer than necessary. She calmly informed him that she would finish her notice period and then leave once he found another worker to replace her. Adrian did not argue. He simply nodded. His usual coldness showed no change. Even so, it would be a few days before another employee could be hired. During this time, Lucia continued to perform her duties, keeping quiet and avoiding unnecessary conversations. But Lucas's presence made it difficult for her to keep her distance. Every night when the house grew quieter and Adrian retired to his office, Lucas became restless, cried, tossed, and turned in his crib and refused to calm down. Lucia couldn't ignore him. Even though she no longer planned to stay, she felt responsible for the child. One night, almost instinctively, she picked him up, sat in a rocking chair, and began humming a simple tune from her childhood. The sound was soft, repeating the same pattern over and over again. To her surprise, Lucas's breathing slowed and his little body relaxed in her arms. It was the first time she had seen him calm down so quickly. From that night on, Lucia repeated the routine. After finishing her chores, she waited until Lucas became restless. Then she gently picked him up, humming the same soft melody. She didn't sing words, just a soft, steady sound, as if her voice alone carried enough comfort. Lucas began to respond almost immediately. His eyes fluttered slowly, his little fist opened as he listened. Within a matter of minutes, he would relax against her chest and fall asleep. For Lucia, it became a moment of quiet connection, something that helped her forget about the demands of the house. She didn't expect anyone to notice, but what she didn't know was that Adrian had begun to pause outside the nursery door. The first time he heard the melody, he had stopped out of curiosity. He had never heard Lucia sing before and wondered why she was in Lucas's room for so long. But as he leaned quietly close to the door, he felt something unexpected. The soft sound filled the hallway in a way the house hadn't felt in months. He stayed longer than he intended, listening quietly, as Lucia's soft voice lulled Lucas to sleep. Adrian told himself it was just a coincidence. But the next night, he found himself returning to the same spot outside the door. He leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, listening to the constant melody. The sound was neither professional nor trained, but it conveyed a certain warmth that unsettled him. Inside the room, he heard Lucas's cries fade away, replaced by calm breathing. For a man accustomed to controlling everything with strict rules, and money, this simple act seemed almost unbelievable. He recalled countless nights when Lucas had refused to calm down, when he had called babysitters, doctors, and even specialists to explain why his son couldn't sleep peacefully. None of their advice had worked. Yet here was Lucia, a woman he had almost fired, calming the child with nothing more than a song. Adrian didn't go in. He remained at the door without ever revealing his presence. But he couldn't deny the effect that the routine had on him. The emptiness of the house that had tormented him since his wife's death felt different while Lucia sang. He still fought the thought, but part of him knew that he was beginning to look forward to those moments every night. Lucia was unaware of Adrian's silent presence. For her, she was simply doing what she felt was right for Lucas. She never considered it anything extraordinary. It was a lullaby she remembered from her own family, a song her mother used to sing when she was a child. She had no idea how much it affected both Lucas and Adrian. Every night she entered the nursery with the same quiet determination. Even when the day had been difficult, she carried Lucas close, rocking him gently in the rocking chair, repeating the melody until he fell asleep. Every night she entered the nursery with the same quiet determination. Even when the day had been difficult, she carried Lucas close, rocking gently in the rocking chair, repeating the melody until his eyelids grew heavy. She noticed small changes in him, how he began to rest his head on her shoulder more easily, how he no longer fought against sleep, how the tension in his little body faded away. For her, these were signs of trust, proof that even though she was leaving soon, she had made a small difference. In those quiet minutes, she almost forgot her decision to leave. The room felt different, warmer, filled with something fragile but real. She believed it belonged only to her and Lucas, never knowing that someone else shared those nights from the other side of the door. Adrian, on the other hand, had his own conflict. Every time he heard Kuna's song, it awakened feelings he had tried to bury. The sound reminded him of his wife. Although Lucia's voice was different, it wasn't the same, but it filled a similar space. The house had been silent for so long, filled only with Lucas's cries and his own harsh orders. The soft melody pierced that silence and replaced it with something gentler. Adrian found himself spending more time outside the door each night, sometimes leaning against the frame, other times closing his eyes as if to let the sound reach him more deeply. He never admitted it out loud, but he needed those minutes almost as much as Lucas. They gave him something he had lost, a feeling that his home was not only a place of grief and control, but also a place where comfort could still exist. Although he tried to remain cold and distant during the day, at night he became a silent witness to Lucia's quiet ritual. Lucia. He began to wonder what would happen when she left and if the silence would return stronger than before. As the days passed, the routine continued. Lucia sang, Lucas relaxed, and Adrian listened. Every night unfolded the same way. However, each time carried a new weight for Adrian. He didn't tell anyone about his silent visits to the nursery door. He didn't want Lucia to know he was there, and he didn't want to face the vulnerability that came with admitting how much he depended on those moments. Still, he couldn't help returning. It was as if the melody filled not only the nursery, but also the empty parts of his own life. For the first time in months, he felt the crushing silence of the house soften. He still intended to let Lucia go, convinced that it was for the best, but deep down he feared losing the sound that now accompanied him throughout the night. And so, without realizing it, Adrian also became part of the nightly ritual. Lucia singing, Lucas calming down, and he himself listening quietly from the doorway, absorbing a melody that seemed to bring life back to a house long overshadowed by loss. Adrian wasn't looking for anything when he opened the small cabinet in Manet's closet. He had been looking for some house documents that the staff used to keep there, but as he moved a pile of folded sheets, something caught his eye. Small cabinet in Manet's closet. He had been looking for some household documents that the staff used to keep there, but as he moved a pile of folded sheets, something slid out. A simple, slightly worn photo frame lay among the fabric. Curious, Adrian picked it up. The photo showed Lucia, much younger, standing next to a young boy who clearly shared her features. The boy's eyes were distant, his smile uneven, and his hands were clenched tightly in front of him. Adrian looked closer and recognized familiar signs, movements, and expressions he had seen in Lucas. The boy in the photo was clearly autistic. Lucia, however, was smiling warmly with one arm around her brother, as if she had done so 1,000 times before. The image hit Adrian harder than he had expected. Suddenly, her patience, her calm voice, and her instinctive way of handling Lucas made sense. She wasn't guessing or experimenting blindly. She had lived through this before. For years, standing there with the photo in his hand, Adrian felt his chest tighten. For the first time, he truly understood that Lucia's actions came from experience, not an interference. She knew Lucas in a way no one else could. He carefully put the photo back, but the image remained fixed in his mind. Thank you very much for listening this far. If you like this type of content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Stories to Fall in Love With. We publish videos every day. And give the video a like if you like this story, and leave us a comment telling us where you're from and what time you listen to us. Now let's continue with the story. All afternoon, Adrian found himself distracted during a conference call. His mind wandered to Lucia's soft tone as she encouraged Lucas. Later, when he stopped by the daycare center, he saw her tidying up toys and humming softly as Lucas crawled at her feet. He looked at her differently. Now, instead of seeing a coworker crossing boundaries, he saw a sister who had once carried the responsibility of someone like Lucas. He imagined the years she must have spent helping her brother, the patience it required, the frustration she probably felt but never showed it. It explained everything. The way she celebrated small steps, the way she never seemed to tire of repeating things, the way she remained calm when Lucas resisted. Adrian realized that all the women he had hired before were professionals, but none had a personal understanding. Lucia did. The thought unsettled him, but it also softened something inside him. For months, he had told himself that no one could take care of Lucas the way his wife had. Now he realized he had been wrong. Lucia might not replace his wife, but she had qualities that made her different from anyone else who had ever entered this house. Later that night, Adrian stood by the office window thinking about what to do. He usually kept his distance from Lucia, speaking only when necessary and keeping interactions short and cold. But after what he had discovered, that distance suddenly felt unnatural. He thought about his wife, how she had once said that patience was more powerful than control when raising a child like Lucas. He realized that Lucia had been demonstrating this to him for weeks, but he had been too stubborn to see it. A decision began to form in his mind, one that felt unusual but necessary. When he finally left his office, he walked down the hallway at a slower pace than usual. He found Lucia in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. She looked up, surprised when he entered, expecting another short instruction or criticism. Instead, Adrian paused, his usual stern expression replaced by hesitation. For the first time, he called her name softly, without anger. Lucia froze when she heard him, surprised by the difference in his tone. She nodded politely, waiting for him to continue, not knowing what this new version of him meant. Adrian cleared his throat, feeling almost uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Would you like to have tea with me?" he asked, his voice firm but unusually soft. Lucia blinked, not sure if she had heard correctly. He had never before invited her to sit down, and with him hesitated, looking at the table she was cleaning, but then nodded slightly. Adrian pointed toward the living room, and they walked there together in silence. When a staff member brought the tea, Adrian poured it himself, something Lucia had never seen him do before. The atmosphere seemed strange to her, almost as if she had entered someone else's life. She sat stiffly, not knowing how to act, but Adrian broke the silence. He told her that he had noticed the way Lucas responded to her, that her presence seemed to bring out something in him that no one else had been able to. He slowly and carefully admitted that she had done more for his son than all the professionals he had hired before. Lucia listened to her hands squeezing the teacup, not knowing whether to speak or remain silent. For Adrian, the words were difficult to say. He had built a wall of control and authority since the day his wife had died, convincing himself that only his way was acceptable. Sitting there now, admitting that someone else had succeeded where he had failed, felt both humiliating and liberating. He looked at Lucia and added that he now understood that her patience came from a real place. He told her, without explaining how, that he knew she had experience caring for someone like Lucas. He didn't go into detail about the photo, but he let her know that he had realized that her strength was not accidental. Lucia looked down, her throat tight, realizing that he must have seen the photo of her brother. She felt exposed, but also relieved. For so long, she had hidden that part of her life, fearing it would be misunderstood. Now, hearing Adrian talk about it with respect, she felt a mixture of emotions, shame, pride, and a cautious confidence. The conversation ended in silence. Adrian did not press further or ask any personal questions. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his tone softer than she had ever heard it, and repeated her name again, as if to remind her that he saw her as more than just an employee. Lucia said, "Thank you." Those words, simple but heavy, carried more meaning than any order or reprimand she had ever heard before. Lucia nodded, not knowing how to respond, but her chest warmed with the recognition. That night, as she returned to her room, she replayed his words over and over again. Adrian, on the other hand, remained in the living room, staring at his untouched tea, knowing that something in their relationship had changed. For the first time, he had let his guard down, and in doing so, had recognized what Lucia had really done for his son. The storm began late at night, rattling the windows of the house with heavy rain and thunder. Adrian was in his office pretending to read a document, although his attention kept drifting to the sound of the storm. Lucas was in his room already restless, and Lucia was moving silently through the hallways, checking that everything was in its place. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The house, usually filled with artificial light, was suddenly engulfed in darkness. Adrian froze. His heart skipped a beat when the sound of Lucas's crying broke the silence. The baby's wailing grew louder and louder, filled with fear, as he struggled to understand the sudden change around him. Adrian ran to the nursery, but when he arrived, he stood helplessly by the door. Lucas was shaking, screaming, his little hands pulling at the bars of the crib, his small body overwhelmed by the darkness and the noise outside. Adrian wanted to act, to comfort his son, but his body froze. Every attempt he imagined seemed futile. He grabbed the door frame, his chest tight, the familiar weight of failure pressing down on him. In his mind, every cry from Lucas sounded like proof that he wasn't enough, that no matter what he tried, he couldn't reach him. Lucia entered quickly, her movements calm and steady, as if the blackout had not taken her by surprise. She held a lighter in her hand and lit the first candle she found on the dresser. The warm glow softened the shadows in the room. Then she placed more candles around, moving with a confidence that contrasted with Adrian's paralyzed state. Once the dim light returned, she approached the crib and lifted Lucas into her arms without hesitation. She held him close, rocking him gently, her voice beginning its familiar melody. The same melody she had sung on quiet nights filled the room again, but now it carried more strength, more confidence. Lucas's cries began to turn into sobs, then whimpers, his body slowly relaxing against her. Adrian watched from the side with his fists clenched at his sides. He hated how natural she looked, how easy she had made what he couldn't do. But at the same time, he felt relief wash over him. He could see Lucas calming down in Lucia's arms, something that had seemed impossible just moments before. The guilt inside him grew heavier, but along with it came admiration, a recognition that he had no control. Here she did. Adrian approached, his voice shaking when he finally spoke. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, almost whispering, although the storm outside drowned out nothing. Lucia didn't turn her head, she continued rocking Lucas. Her song never interrupted. Adrian slumped into the chair near the crib, his eyes fixed on his son. "I keep failing him," he said, his throat tight. "Every time he needs me, I freeze. I don't know how to help him. I don't know how to be what he needs." He paused, pressing his hand against his forehead, his chest heaving heavily. For so long he had hidden behind his anger, his demands, his dismissals of others. But at this moment, with thunder shaking the house and candlelight flickering, he felt stripped of all defenses. His voice broke as he finally said the words he had buried for so long. "I'm afraid I'll never be enough for him." It was the first time he had spoken his fear aloud, and the weight of it left him trembling. Lucia finally turned her head slightly, though she did not stop rocking. "I'm afraid I'll never be good enough for him." It was the first time he had spoken his fear aloud, and the weight of it left him trembling. Lucia finally turned her head slightly, though she didn't stop rocking Lucas. She looked at Adrian with calm eyes, but said nothing. Instead, she moved closer and sat down next to him on the edge of the chair, balancing Lucas between them. The baby's breathing was calmer. Now, his face pressed against her shoulder, he was soothed by the song. Lucia slowly extended her free hand, as if giving Adrian the opportunity to refuse. He didn't. He let her take his hand, her touch firm but warm. For a moment, Adrian closed his eyes, feeling both ashamed and relieved. He had never allowed anyone to see him so exposed, so broken. However, Lucia did not judge. She did not tell him he was wrong or that he was weak. She simply held his hand firmly and silently, letting the silence carry more meaning than words ever could. At that moment, Adrian felt something loosen inside him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to show his weakness shamelessly. The storm outside continued, but inside the room the atmosphere changed. Lucas was calm now, his body relaxed, his little hands no longer trembling. The light from the candles flickered on the walls, casting long shadows that danced gently. Adrian's hand remained in Lucia's, and although no words were exchanged between them, the silence was different. This time it was not the heavy silence of grief or guilt that had filled their home for so long. It was a silence of understanding, one that gave him room to breathe. He felt that Lucia was not carrying his burden for him, but sharing it, reminding him that he was not alone in this struggle. Adrian had spent months excluding people, convinced that no one could understand his pain or the needs of his son. However, here was Lucia sitting next to him, showing him that his fear did not have to destroy him. He felt small but not useless, weak but not abandoned. For the first time, he began to believe that perhaps being enough wasn't about never failing. It was about not giving up. As the storm began to calm outside, the room settled into stillness. Lucas had fallen completely asleep, his soft little breath against Lucia's shoulder. She gently placed him back in the crib, pulling the blanket over him before sitting back down. Adrian remained where he was, his hand still clasped to hers. He didn't thank her or try to explain himself further. There was no need. Lucia didn't speak either, understanding that words would only break the fragile honesty of the moment. In that silence, Adrian felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. The relief of not having to pretend. The blackout had revealed more than the absence of electricity. It had forced him to face the truth he had buried, his fear, his limitations. and his need for help. And although he had admitted his weakness, he didn't feel ashamed. With Lucia's steady hand in his, he felt something new, something he thought he had lost forever. The courage to keep going, even in the darkness. It was a quiet afternoon of the kind that usually passed without anything special happening. Lucia sat on the floor with Lucas, a few toys scattered on the carpet around her. She had learned not to push him too hard, letting him explore at his own pace, even if his movements were slower and his reactions were often delayed. That day, he picked up a soft stuffed animal and gently hid it. For her, these were signs of trust, proof that even though she was leaving soon, she had made a small difference. In those quiet minutes, she almost forgot her decision to leave. The room felt different, warmer, filled with something fragile but real. She believed it belonged only to her and Lucas, never knowing that someone else shared those nights from the other side of the door. Adrian, on the other hand, had his own conflict. Every time he heard Kuna's song, it awakened feelings he had tried to bury. The sound reminded him of his wife. Although Lucia's voice was different, it wasn't the same, but it filled a similar space. The house had been silent for so long, filled only with Lucas's cries and his own harsh orders. The soft melody pierced that silence and replaced it with something gentler. Adrian found himself spending more time outside the door each night, sometimes leaning against the frame, other times closing his eyes as if to let the sound reach him more deeply. He never admitted it out loud, but he needed those minutes almost as much as Lucas. They gave him something he had lost, a feeling that his home was not only a place of grief and control, but also a place where comfort could still exist. Although he tried to remain cold and distant during the day, at night he became a silent witness to Lucia's quiet ritual. Lucia. He began to wonder what would happen when she left and if the silence would return stronger than before. As the days passed, the routine continued. Lucia sang, Lucas relaxed, and Adrian listened. Every night unfolded the same way. However, each time carried a new weight for Adrian. He didn't tell anyone about his silent visits to the nursery door. He didn't want Lucia to know he was there, and he didn't want to face the vulnerability that came with admitting how much he depended on those moments. Still, he couldn't help returning. It was as if the melody filled not only the nursery, but also the empty parts of his own life. For the first time in months, he felt the crushing silence of the house soften. He still intended to let Lucia go, convinced that it was for the best, but deep down he feared losing the sound that now accompanied him throughout the night. And so, without realizing it, Adrian also became part of the nightly ritual. Lucia singing, Lucas calming down, and he himself listening quietly from the doorway, absorbing a melody that seemed to bring life back to a house long overshadowed by loss. Adrian wasn't looking for anything when he opened the small cabinet in Manet's closet. He had been looking for some house documents that the staff used to keep there. She didn't notice that Adrian was watching her from the doorway. For her, it was just a precious moment, something to encourage and repeat gently. She had seen Lucas's struggles, his silence, and his tendency to withdraw. That he would laugh so freely without fear or hesitation was nothing short of incredible. She continued to play, her movements steady but cheerful, making sure not to overwhelm him. The room, usually quiet and heavy, now echoed with Lucas's giggles and Lucia's warm breath. It was the kind of sound that made everything else fade away. Adrian's eyes clouded over slightly, though he quickly blinked to hold back the moisture. He had spent months trying to create a home for Lucas that was organized, controlled, and disciplined. He had believed that structure was the key, that strict routines and boundaries would protect his son. However, all that effort had only made the house feel colder. Now, looking in from the doorway, Adrian saw the truth. What Lucas had needed was not rules and order, it was comfort, security, and someone who made him feel safe enough to let go. Lucia had given him that without even trying. She had built it through patience, kindness, and small, everyday actions that Adrian had overlooked. He swallowed hard, realizing how wrong he had been. This laughter was not only Lucas's, it was also Lucia's victory. She had opened a door that Adrian couldn't even find. And for the first time, instead of resisting the idea, he embraced it. He stepped further into the room, his steps slow and deliberate, still afraid of interrupting the moment, but he couldn't stay away anymore. Lucia finally looked up and noticed him. She straightened up a little, not knowing how long he had been there. For a brief moment, she thought he might scold her again for crossing invisible lines, but his face was different. This time there was no coldness or anger. Her features were soft, almost fragile, her eyes fixed on Lucas, who continued to laugh as he hugged the stuffed animal tightly. Eyed Duran's approached, letting himself fall onto the edge of the nearby armchair. He leaned forward with his hands clasped together and let out a trembling sigh. "Thank you, Lucia," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. The sincerity in his tone surprised her. It was not the distant, formal gratitude of an employer. It was genuine, raw, carrying the weight of a man who had just witnessed something invaluable. Lucia nodded, not knowing what to say, but her eyes softened, understanding what he meant without the need for further words. For Adrian, that moment changed everything. He realized that laughter had done what nothing else could. It had broken the silence that had plagued his home since his wife's death. Lucas's laughter was proof that the boy could feel joy, and it was proof that Lucia had created an environment where joy could exist again. Adrian looked at her and finally understood that what was missing in his home was not discipline, order, or perfection. It was the feeling of protection and comfort that Lucia had brought back. For the first time, he allowed himself to accept it openly. The man who had once been consumed by control and fear now bowed his head slightly, humbled, grateful, and deeply moved. Lucas's laughter continued to echo softly in the background, and Adrian knew he would never forget this day. It wasn't just his son's first laugh, it was also the first time he truly saw his home beginning to heal. Lucia was sitting in her small room looking at the letter in her hands. It was an official offer from a specialized school for children with autism, the kind of place she had once dreamed of working at. She was sitting in her small room looking at the letter in her hands. It was an official offer from a specialized school for children with autism, the kind of place she had once dreamed of working at. Lucia was sitting in her small room looking at the letter in her hands. It was an official offer. Lucia was sitting in her small room looking at the letter in her hands. It was an official offer from a specialized school for children with autism, the kind of place she had once dreamed of working at. For years, she had wanted to devote herself to helping children like her brother, and now the opportunity was real. The school had contacted her after learning about her experience and compassion, offering her a stable position with a clear purpose. She felt joy and guilt as she read the words over and over again. The idea of leaving Lucas behind weighed heavily on her heart, but she also knew that the job could mean the opportunity to fulfill her lifelong dream. Unsure of how to handle the situation, she folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. She decided not to tell Adrian, at least not yet, her as usual, but her mind kept returning to the decision she would eventually have to make. Every moment with Lucas became heavier, more meaningful, because she didn't know how much longer she would be there. The secret weighed heavily on her chest, and although she tried to hide it, her silence spoke louder than she realized. Adrian was not blind to the changes. He noticed the way Lucia's expressions sometimes became distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. He saw her pause while folding the laundry clothes with a lost look on her face, and he caught her sighing softly in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching her. She was still affectionate, still attentive to Lucas, but something in her behavior had changed. She smiled, and when she did, the smile seemed tinged with sadness. Adrian, however, did not ask. He kept his distance, as he always did, convincing himself that it was not his place to pry. Still, unease grew within him. He had come to depend on her presence more than he wanted to admit, and now he felt it slipping away from him. He told himself that she was probably just tired, that she would soon cheer up, but deep down he feared that something bigger was happening. The idea of losing her unsettled him more than he could explain, but his pride and fear of vulnerability prevented him from asking what was going on. He carried the weight silently, pretending not to notice. Happening. The idea of losing her unsettled him more than he could explain, but his pride and fear of vulnerability prevented him from asking what was wrong. He carried the weight in silence, pretending not to notice, while every day it became more difficult to ignore. Then one night, Lucas fell ill. It started with a fever that rose rapidly, leaving him weak and restless. His little body trembled, and his face flushed as he moaned in discomfort. Adrian panicked, his mind racing, but Lucia stepped forward immediately, with quiet authority. She pressed cold claws to Lucas's forehead. carefully took his temperature, and prepared his medicine with precise hands. She stayed by his side, cradling him when he cried, whispering softly to ease his discomfort. Adrian hovered nearby, but every time he tried to help, his hands trembled and his voice faltered. His fear of doing something wrong made him back away. Lucia handled the situation without hesitation, taking full responsibility for caring for Lucas during the long night. Adrian could see her exhaustion, the shadows forming under her eyes, but she never complained. She moved with the natural rhythm of someone who knew what to do, keeping Lucas safe and comforted. Seeing her made Adrian feel relieved and crushed. Relieved that Lucas had someone who understood his needs, and crushed that he himself seemed useless in comparison. The house, dimly lit and heavy with worry, became a place where Lucia's presence was the only steady anchor. As the hours passed, Adrian's strength collapsed. While Lucia stayed close to Lucas, Adrian slipped into the hallway and sat down against the wall, burying his face in his hands. He felt helpless, unable to bear his son's suffering and his own failures at the same time. His chest hurt, his eyes burned, and finally the tears came. He cried silently, his shoulders shaking, letting out everything he had tried so hard to repress. The fear of losing Lucas, the fear of never being good enough, and the deepest fear of losing Lucia all mingled inside him. He realized at that moment how much he had come to depend on her, not only for Lucas's sake, but for his own. The idea that she might leave one day felt unbearable. He stood in the hallway, hidden in the shadows, ashamed of his weakness, but unable to stop himself. His breathing became irregular as the weight of everything he had avoided admitting pressed harder than ever. Lucia finally came out of the nursery to get more medicine and found him there, unable to stop. His breathing became irregular as the weight of everything he had avoided admitting pressed harder than ever. Lucia finally left the nursery to look for more medicine and found him there, slumped against the wall. At first she froze, not knowing whether to disturb him. She saw the redness of his eyes, the way his hands trembled, and the heavy pain written on his face. She slowly approached him with silent movements and crouched down beside him. She didn't speak. Words would only make him retreat again. She knew that. Instead, she placed her hand gently on his shoulder, anchoring him in silence. Adrian lifted his head slightly, surprised to be caught in such a vulnerable state. But Lucia's calm expression contained no judgment. Her presence was steady, her touch firm enough to remind him that he was not alone. For a moment, he wanted to ask him to stay forever, to beg him not to leave, but the words stuck in his throat. He remained silent, caught between his pride and his desperate need. For a moment, he wanted to ask her to stay forever, to beg her not to leave, but the words stuck in his throat. He remained silent, caught between his pride and his desperate need. Lucia stayed by his side, her hand still on his shoulder, and waited. She knew that Adrian was fighting a battle within himself. She could feel that he wanted to speak, to let the words escape, but she also knew that she couldn't force them. They had to come from him. Until then, she would remain present, offering her strength in silence. Inside, she was fighting her own battle, the knowledge of the job offer pulling her in one direction and her bond with Lucas pulling her in another. She wanted him to say it, to admit that he needed her, but she wouldn't press him. Instead, she gave him the space to gather his courage. Adrian, sitting next to her in the dark hallway, felt her steady presence and realized that she was waiting for him. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps asking her to stay would not be weakness, but strength. However, he couldn't say it, at least not yet. The moment ended in silence with Lucia still by his side, both sharing a silence that carried more meaning than any words could. Adrian had avoided that room for months, almost since the day of the funeral. His late wife's bedroom had remained untouched, locked in silence, maintaining her presence in every detail. The perfume bottles on the dressing table, the clothes folded in the wardrobe, the photographs on the bedside table. One night, without thinking, Adrian turned the doorknob and entered. The air was heavy, carrying a familiarity that made his chest ache. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the room as if afraid of disturbing something. For a moment, he simply stood there, frozen, until he noticed a drawer slightly open. Something inside caught his attention. With trembling hands, he opened it completely and discovered a folded envelope resting under a stack of papers. His name was written on it in his wife's handwriting, delicate and firm. His breath caught in his throat. He sat down on the edge of the bed, hesitated, and then carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written before her illness had taken its final toll. Adrian began to read, his eyes following each word as if he could hear her voice once more, guiding him, speaking to him across the distance of time and loss. The letter was short, but each sentence pierced him. His wife wrote about Lucas, about her fears of leaving him behind too soon, and about her hopes for her son's future. She admitted her concern that Adrian might try to raise Lucas alone, carrying the burden without allowing anyone else to help him. She asked him not to close himself off, not to confuse strength with isolation. Let him find love and support, she wrote, in people you don't expect. Don't measure his progress by what he can't do, but by the moments of connection he finds. Adrian's vision blurred as he read those words over and over again. They spoke directly to the very battle he had been fighting since her death. For months he had rejected help, pushing people away, demanding perfection, trying to prove that no one could replace her. Now her words shattered the walls he had built. He pressed the paper against his chest, his hands trembling, as tears ran freely down his face. For the first time he didn't resist them. He allowed himself to cry and feel the truth of her message. He stayed in that room long after finishing the letter. Memories overwhelmed him, his wife's laughter, the way she used to hold Lucas, the plans they had once made for the future. Each image clashed with the emptiness of the present, leaving him broken, but strangely lighter. He lay down on the floor, still clutching the letter tightly in his hands, as if it were the last bridge connecting him to her. The hours passed slowly. The storm inside him slowly calmed, though the pain remained. He whispered small apologies into the silence. Apologies for his mistakes, for his anger, for shutting out the very love she had asked him to let in. Exhaustion finally overcame him. He fell asleep restlessly on the cold floor, his body curled around the letter, refusing to let go. Deep inside him, something had changed. The words had broken the last defenses he had, leaving him open in a way he hadn't been since she was alive. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew he could no longer pretend to be the man of stone he had tried to be. Morning came quietly. Lucia, as always, began her routine early by tidying the house and checking on Lucas. At one point, she noticed that Adrian was not in his office, and she had not seen him since the night before. Curious and a little worried, she walked down the hall and saw the door to her late wife's bedroom ajar. Slowly, she entered. Her eyes widened when she found Adrian asleep on the floor, his hands still clutching a letter as if it were his lifeline. The sight surprised her, not because of where he was, but because of how vulnerable the man who always maintained his strong posture and controlled words, now seemed fragile, exposed, like someone carrying more pain than he could bear. Lucia stood silently, unsure whether to wake him or leave quietly. She decided to move carefully, stepping back to give him space. But as she turned toward the door, the floor creaked softly beneath her, and Adrian stirred. His hand tightened around the letter, his eyes opening slowly, still heavy with exhaustion. He blinked in confusion for a moment, until his gaze fell on Lucia standing in the doorway. She looked at him with concern, but said nothing, ready to leave and give him the privacy she thought he needed. Adrian, however, did not let her go. Before she could leave, his hand reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was not forceful, but it was firm enough to stop her. Lucia froze, looking at him in surprise. For a second, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the unspoken things that had built up over time. Their nights shared with Lucas, the silent struggles, the fears. For a second, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the unspoken things that had accumulated over time. Their nights shared with Lucas, the silent struggles, the fears they had never fully expressed. Adrian's eyes, still wet and tired, met hers. For once, there was no wall, no barrier, no attempt to appear untouchable. He was simply a man carrying his pain, his fear, and his desperate hope. All at once, she swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying a weight that made her heart ache. "Stay," she murmured. The word was simple, but it carried more than any speech could have. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper, carrying a weight that made his heart ache. "Stay," he murmured. The word was simple, but it carried more than any long speech could. It was not an order, not a command, but a plea. In that moment, Adrian was not the billionaire, not the stern employer, not the distant father. He was just a man admitting that he needed her presence, that he did not want to face what lay ahead without her. Lucia stood still, holding her breath, realizing that this was the first time he had ever spoken to her with such honesty. She nodded gently, her hand still in his, and understood that everything had changed. The letter, the pain, the silence, everything had led to this small but powerful request. Adrian pressed the paper against his chest once more, but his other hand did not let go of hers. For the first time since his wife's death, he allowed himself to lean on someone else. And at that moment, Lucia knew she couldn't leave. Adrian had spent the whole day rehearsing the words in his head. For weeks he had carried the fear that Lucia would one day leave, and the letter from his late wife had finally stripped him of any excuse to remain silent. He could no longer deny what was obvious. Lucia was not just another person passing through his house. She had become essential to both Lucas and himself. That night, after dinner, Adrian waited until the house was quiet. He found Lucia in the living room, sitting on the floor with Lucas, while he clumsily stacked wooden blocks. Adrian's chest tightened when he saw him. A mixture of pride and fear twisted inside him. He approached, her voice uncertain, but firm enough to be heard. Lucia began by calling his attention. She looked up quickly, expecting a request or instruction, but what she saw in his eyes was different. Adrian sat down on the armchair in front of her, clasped his hands together, and exhaled slowly. "I need to ask you something," he continued. His tone was softer than she had ever heard it. Her expression became tense, unsure of what was coming, though her heart told her it was important. Lucas, oblivious to the tension, laughed when his tower of blocks collapsed. Lucia smiled briefly at him before turning back to Adrian. He cleared his throat, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. "I don't want you to leave," he finally admitted. The sentence hung in the air, heavier than any order he had ever given. Lucia's eyes widened slightly, surprised, and Adrian leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, speaking more quickly now, as if afraid he would lose his courage if he paused, not just as an employee, not just until I find someone else. I mean, stay as part of this life with us. His voice broke slightly, but he continued. "You've done more for Lucas than I could have ever imagined, more than I can pay for. But I don't want this to be about salary, contracts, or duties. I want you to belong here, not because of a mom, but because we need you, because I need you." His words trembled, but they were honest, and Lucia felt them deeply. For a moment, Lucia froze, processing what he had just said. She had never expected to hear words like this from Adrian, the man who had once been cold, distant, and impossible to reach. She felt a lump form in her throat. Her eyes began to stinging with tears. She tried to hold back. Adrian continued, his voice firmer now. "I know you've dreamed of studying, of building something for yourself. If you stay, I'll help you with that. Whatever you need, time, resources, support, you'll have it. I don't want you to give up on your future just because you're here. I want you to grow, to achieve everything you have dreamed of. But I also want you to do it as part of this family." His gaze dropped for a second. His pride faltered before adding almost in a whisper, "I can't do this alone, and I don't want to anymore." The confession, spoken without hesitation this time, broke down every wall she had once built around herself. Lucia could see it clearly. She wasn't offering him a job, she was offering him a place in their lives. Tears slid down her cheeks before she could stop them. She put her hand to her mouth, trying to control her emotions, but Lucas's small hand tugged at her sleeve, making her laugh softly through her tears. She looked back at Adrian, her chest full of emotions that words could barely contain. Adrian began, his voice trembling but clear. "I don't need a contract. I don't need your last name to belong here." He paused, swallowing hard as the tears continued to fall. "From the moment Lucas reached me, from the moment I decided to stay by his side, I was already part of this family. That wasn't because of money, work, or obligations. It's because of love, trust, and something I can't put into words. I don't need you to ask me to stay because I never really planned on leaving. His words came from his heart, simple and true. Adrian stared at her intently, unable to speak at first, but the relief that washed over him was visible in the way his shoulders slumped. The tension in his face faded. Lucas clapped his hands when he heard the laughter of his mother figure, oblivious to the depth of what had just been exchanged between the two adults. Adrian leaned back in his chair with his eyes fixed on Lucia, and for the first time in what seemed like years, a real smile spread across his face. Not the polite, forced smile he gave at business meetings, not the thin expression he used to hide his pain. This one was different, warm, defenseless, almost like a man rediscovering something he thought was lost forever. Lucia wiped away her tears, returning his smile, and the heaviness gave way to something lighter, something hopeful. In that room, it felt as if a new chapter was beginning. Lucia wiped away her tears, returning his smile, and the heaviness gave way to something lighter, something hopeful. In that room, it felt as if a new chapter was beginning, one where Lucas's laughter, Lucia's presence, and Adrian's acceptance would finally blend together into a feeling of home. Adrian took a deep breath, letting out a shaky sigh, but this time it wasn't out of fear, it was out of relief. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was full, rich with the weight of everything they had just confessed, without the need for long explanations. Adrian slowly got up, walked over and crouched down next to Lucas, who was now babbling happily as he stacked his blocks. He looked at his son again, then at Lucia, and whispered softly, almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. "We are no longer just three people living in the same house." Lucia nodded. Her eyes were still moist, but shining with certainty. Adrian approached, gently brushing Lucas's hair aside. Then he looked at Lucia once more. Her smile still lingered. For the first time, he truly believed that they were no longer surviving day to day in a house filled with silence and pain. They were becoming a family, and in that realization, Adrian felt lighter than he had felt in years, knowing that he had not simply asked her to stay, he had finally recognized that she already belonged. Lucia's graduation ceremony day came after years of dedication, study, and balancing responsibilities at home with Lucas. The large hall was filled with rows of chairs, graduates in their gowns, and families. The day of Lucia's graduation ceremony came after years of dedication, study, and balancing responsibilities at home with Lucas. The great hall was filled with rows of chairs, graduates in their gowns, and families waiting with excitement. Lucia was among the students with her cap firmly in place, her eyes shining with pride, but also with humility. She remembered the long nights of studying after putting Lucas to bed. The mornings she woke up early to make breakfast before going to her classes, and the countless times she doubted she would finish. Yet here she was, wearing the cap and gown she once thought belonged only to others. In the audience, Lucas, now older, was sitting between Adrian and some other relatives. His hands held a cardboard sign he had secretly prepared with Adrian's help. The letters were bold, written with colored markers. "We love you, Mom." As Lucia walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Lucas held the sign high with both hands, his face beaming with joy. Lucia froze for a brief second when she saw him, her throat tightening as her eyes welled up. She clutched the diploma to her chest and smiled broadly. In that moment, she felt that her entire journey had been worth every step. Adrian stood up and applauded, louder than anyone around him. His face was openly emotional. He had watched Lucia grow from the quiet and insecure woman who once entered his home as a domestic worker to the confident and accomplished woman who stood on stage. His pride was not only for her achievement, but for the life they had built together years ago. He had believed that his home would always be filled with silence and pain, but Lucia had proved him wrong. He remembered his wife's letter, the words telling him to let Lucas find love and support in unexpected places. Now, watching Lucia graduate, he knew he had fulfilled that request. She had not only taken care of Lucas, but had become his mother in every way that mattered. Adrian clapped until his hands hurt, his chest filled with gratitude and pride. Lucas leaned against his side, smiling brightly and whispering, "You did it, Dad." Adriana felt his eyes still fixed on Lucia, thinking to himself that she had done much more than just graduate. She had given his family a second chance at life. After the ceremony ended, everyone gathered outside. Lucas ran toward Lucia with the sign still in his hands, almost tripping over his own feet with excitement. "Mom, Sal," he called, wrapping his arms tightly around her. Lucia knelt down, hugging him back with tears running freely down her face. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Thank you, my love." Adrian approached slowly, giving them a moment before joining them. When Lucia looked at him, their eyes met and no words were needed. She simply opened her arms and she entered his embrace, holding Lucas between them. Cameras flashed around them as other families celebrated, but Adrian didn't care about any of that. For him, the image in his mind was enough. Lucia holding Lucas, the diploma in her hand, and himself by her side. It was the image of the family he never thought he would have again. Complete and strong, not because of perfection, but because of the love they had chosen to nurture. Lucia's heart swelled as she realized that this was not just her victory, but theirs. Together they had built something unbreakable. When they returned home that night, the house was alive with laughter and warmth. Lucas, still full of excitement, carried his poster everywhere, proudly showing it to every visitor who came to congratulate Lucia. Later, when things calmed down, the three of them settled into the living room. Lucas curled up on the sofa and looked at Lucia with hopeful eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "can you sing the song?" Lucia tilted her head, surprised for a moment. She then smiled knowingly. It was the same melody she had sung years ago, when Lucas was just a restless baby in her arms. She nodded as she sat down next to him and began to hum the familiar tune. Her voice was steady, filled with the same warmth it had always had, but now it was joined by something else. Years of memories, struggles, and triumphs that gave the melody a deeper meaning. Lucas rested his head on her shoulder, happy and calm, his body relaxing with each note. The house, once marked by pain, now vibrated with the simple beauty of their shared song. Adrian, sitting nearby, listened quietly at first. The sound of Lucia's voice brought back countless nights when he had stood at the door of the nursery, afraid to enter, but unable to walk away. Back then, he had only been a silent witness, but now, after everything they had faced together, he no longer wanted to remain on the sidelines. Slowly, he began to hum along, his deep voice blending with hers. Lucia looked at him in surprise, but her smile widened as he continued. Lucas looked between them, his eyes bright, and whispered, "Sing louder, Dad." Adrian chuckled and joined in completely. His voice was uncertain at first, but it grew stronger. Points. Their voices filled the living room, weaving a melody that was no longer just a lullaby. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome. The song that once calmed Lucas in moments of fear was now a celebration of family, of unity, of rediscovered love. The evening ended with laughter, hugs, and the sound of their song still floating in the air. Adrian reclined on the sofa with his arm around Lucia, watching Lucas fall asleep with a peaceful smile. He thought about how far they had come, from silence and pain to this moment of harmony. What had once been a home divided by grief was now a home rebuilt by trust, patience, and love. Adrian looked at Lucia, his hand gently squeezing hers, and whispered, "We are a family forever." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder, her heart full. The house, which had once felt empty, now had life in every corner. There were no more employers and employees, no more walls between them. Just a family that had chosen to stay together, rebuilt not out of obligation, but out of courage and love. In that home, silence no longer meant sadness. It had been replaced by music, laughter, and the certainty that they would face each morning side by side. Thank you very much for listening this far, and if you like this type of content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Stories to Fall in Love With. We publish videos every day, so like the video if you like this story and leave us a comment telling us where you're from and what time you listen to us. Yes.